This is an introduction to McCay, chapter 18, Life in the Era of Expansion. And it covers the exact same time period that chapter 17 covered, from 1650 to 1800. It's very much a companion to the economic expansion that we talked about in chapter 17. If chapter 17 is the economic history of why the expansion happened, chapter 18 is the question, well, how does all this expansion affect the way people actually live? So this is essentially a social history chapter. You're not going to get a lot of politics in this section. Instead, we're talking about the ways that people actually experience their daily lives. And we're talking regular people here, not just kings or emperors or big shots, but normal, everyday people. And just FYI, this is one of the areas of history that's really expanded over the last few decades. More and more attention has been given to social history. The AP test is incorporating more and more of that kind of stuff. So, particularly if you're interested in this sort of what was life like for real people, this chapter is for you. Okay, so the two big questions that you should be thinking about as we move through this chapter, which are, first, what were the everyday experiences of ordinary people, and how did they change over the 18th century? So sort of a classic change over time question. Right? How does the lived experience of people in this society change during this time period? And then, sort of keeping your eye on the bigger narrative, what are the connections between the intellectual changes of chapter 16, Scientific Revolution and Enlightenment, and the economic expansion of chapter 17 with the actual lives of 18th century people? So think about the things we've been covering over the last couple of chapters and now apply that to the experience of people in this time period as they actually lived. Okay, so with that introduction, let's go through the individual sections of the chapter. First, marriage and the family. And the question here that McCay poses, very straightforward: what changes occurred during the 18th century? Right? What change over time? How do marriage and family life change during this period? And it's worth stepping back just for a moment. If I were to ask you what were the most important things in your life today, the things that are most central to your identity, your happiness, your well-being, I suspect very high on your list would be family life. Your mom, your dad, your sisters, your home, all that kind of stuff. That's really, really important. And yet, most history books don't talk about that kind of stuff very much. And so this is a chance for us to sort of stop and say, well, here's this thing which is tremendously important. How is it changing as a consequence of these big themes? Then we turn to children and education. And again, a pretty straightforward question. What was life like for children during this time period? And how did attitudes towards children evolve? We see during this time period a real change in how people look at children, how they think about childhood, and those changes are coming out of the economic, political, cultural, intellectual changes that we've been looking at up till now. There's a nice primary source here called the Catechism of Health, which is kind of fun, where the author tries in a sort of simple way to teach people about this new insights into health and well-being. The scientific revolution has brought us these new thinking about medicine and healthcare, and how do we get people to practice that? Well, we push this out in this catechism, and I think you might be surprised at how contemporary a lot of it sounds. A lot of the advice in this catechism will not strike you as bizarre or weird, but it will sound to you like the kind of thing that you might find in a manual that you would give to a new mother in the 21st century. Maybe not all of it, but some of it. So read that as you're thinking about this. Next is a really fun section on popular culture and consumerism. And the question that McCay puts here is, how does increase in literacy and new patterns of consumption affect people's lives? People's lives are going to be changing for all kinds of reasons, but the increase in education that comes out of the Enlightenment and the increase in consumption that comes out of economic expansion, those together are going to change people's lives, and in ways that will become more and more familiar to us as we begin to look at consumer culture. Speaking of consumer culture, there's a really good introduction to a woman named Rose Bertin. Rose Bertin, the Minister of Fashion. And this is Rose, and this is one of her dresses. She was the trendsetter in 18th century Paris. Her sense of fashion and design really set the standard for what women were supposed to wear. And her story is pretty fascinating. So spend a little time getting to know Mademoiselle Bertin. Then we get into religious belief and how religious views are changing. We haven't necessarily talked about religion so much since we moved out of the Reformation and its consequences. But religion is still going forward and still evolving. And the question here is, what were the patterns of popular religion, again, religion as people actually experienced it, and how they interact with the worldview of the educated public and their Enlightenment ideas? Notice that McCay is setting up a tension here between, on the one hand, the educated elite, right, with their Enlightenment rationalism and their pulling away from many old views of religion, and on the other hand, you have popular religion. Religion as people actually practice it, as distinct from a small elite that may be reading Rousseau or Diderot or something like that. So there's a really interesting section to keep your eye on for religion. And then finally, the last section is medical practice. Medicine is another one of these things where the initial changes and insights of the scientific revolution are then applied through the Enlightenment, and now they begin to actually impact people's lives. And the question is, how does the actual practice of medicine evolve in the 18th century? How do people actually live and experience medical treatment now? This cartoon from McCay is just one example. It's a rather satirical description, but vaccination becomes a thing. And vaccination saves millions and millions of lives. So that's just one little piece of this story. Okay, so it's a really fun chapter. It asks you to think about a bunch of concepts that maybe you haven't done a lot of in history before, but I hope you enjoy it, and I will see you in class.